Good afternoon. Dr. B, ready to rock and roll with some good life history information. In this second video, we're going to talk about case selected species and then move to talking about a system of classification of strategies for plants called the CS and R system of J.P. Grime. K selected species. The K stands for carrying capacity. K selected species. Again, this RNK system was developed by Robert MacArthur and E.O. Wilson at Harvard University and Eric Pianka. R selected species are basically opposite in their characteristics compared to K-selected species. Small, short-lived, high reproductive rates. Most young do not survive to maturity. Live in disturbed habitats. Good colonizers of disturbed environments. Very little parental care. So K-selected species are the opposite of R. Larger sized, longer lived, less offspring per reproductive event. Their population is fairly stable. They provide parental care, or they have fewer young per reproductive event. They live in more stable, undisturbed habitats. They're not good colonizers, but they are good competitors for those resources needed for survival and reproduction. An elephant is a good example of a case-selected species. The the third slide in this video just kind of provides a chart of characteristics of R and K selected species. One of the videos that I put up on Canvas shows to you that there's a lot of gray area. One organism can be R selected at one point in its life and K selected in another. The presenter in the video I put on Canvas mentions that human males tend to be more R selected and human females tend to be more K selected. If you look primarily at our production of reproductive propagules or our fecundity. Okay. So, R and K selection. It's a system of looking at evolution of life history characteristics that lead to higher survival and reproductive rates and lead to perpetuation of a species. J.P. Grime is an English population biologist, one of my advisors in graduate school was one of his students. So I am J.P. Grimes' academic grandchild, if that makes sense to you. He published in a textbook on plant population ecology, a life history classification of plants that he put together in this triangle called the CSR classification scheme. C standing for competitors, S standing for stress tolerators, and R standing for rootables. Similar to the R&K strategy of MacArthur and Wilson and Pianka, but with a third category. And you might also notice that he included the gray area as those plants with intermediate strategies. So the R&K strategies of MacArthur and Wilson don't really provide for the large gray area that does exist. Competitors tend to be carrying capacity or K-selected species. They tend to do best in environments where there is little stress and little disturbance. Stress tolerators tend to prefer stress such as lack of water, but they do not do well under disturbance. Rudderals tend to prefer not a lot of stress, but disturbance. So rudderals in this classification equals R selection by MacArthur and Wilson. Annual plants tend to fit our selection or the ruderal uh, classification. Biennial plants tend to be in the R selected side of the triangle. Annual plants live for one growing season. Biennial plants complete their life in two growing seasons. And perennial plants, as you might see, are in the intermediate category. They tend to complete their life over a span of many years. They're long lived. Trees and shrubs that produce wood tend to be clustered in the competitive to the stress tolerating side, with a lot of trees and shrubs in the intermediate categories between those C and S portions of the triangle. Lichens are again a mutualistic organism of a fungus and an alga. They tend to cluster in the stress tolerating category. And bryophytes, moss, liverwort, small little plants, tend to be clustered in between stress tolerators and rudderals. So you might notice that different types of plants do tend to have their own unique pattern within this classification triangle, this CS and R triangle. So I've got some slides to just describe each of these categories. I'm going to start over on the bottom right, the rudderals. Prolific producers of seeds, mainly annuals, living for one growing season, growing and maturing fast, preferring disturbed conditions where they can perpetuate themselves, and being intolerant of both shade and stress. So rudderals tend to prefer conditions of high light, and they tend to not do well with drought, lack of water. They tend to prefer mineral-rich, nutrient-rich soil as well. Dandelion and clover are shown in the two photographs. Stress tolerators, pine trees are a good example, as are lichens. They tend to do well with lack of water. They can tolerate drought better than other plants. They have adaptations for storing water and or nutrients. They can often live in nutrient poor soil. They're often not tolerant of shade. They prefer open, well lit conditions, and they tend to be long lived. Okay, so stress tolerators, pine trees, rudderals, weedy plants that you might find in your lawn or in an agricultural field. Competitors, think of plants that live in a nice wooded forest, if you will, such as an oak tree or a beech tree or a maple. Competitors tend to be shade tolerant. That means they can grow under other plants in conditions that are not well lit, and then they can grow up above those plants that they once grew under. They're very strong competitors for both water and nutrients. They're not very tolerant of disturbance or water stress, but they're usually very long lived, and when they do reproduce, they tend to put a lot of energy into their offspring. If you look at the acorns, you notice how big they are, and if you were to open up an acorn, you would see the amount of food, energy that is placed into the acorn for the next generation, the seed, the seedling. So C, S, and R, different life history strategies of plants, with a lot of plants that are intermediate between those three categories. So if you have a piece of land or you have a piece of bare uh, area that has never supported plants, different plants and animals tend to prefer different habitats. And we refer to the change of one group of plants and animals with another group of plants and animals. We consider this to be called succession, ecological succession. Primary succession is when different types of plants and animals will occupy a piece of bare land that's never had growth of plants and associated animals before, such as maybe an island of sand or a bare rock or an island that's been created from volcanic activity. So we refer to that as primary succession. And different groups of plants and associated animals will occupy a bare piece of land as it changes. Different types of plants and animals will occupy the environments because they have different life history characteristics that are preferred in those particular environments. And compare that with secondary succession. Some people call it old field succession, where you start out with a piece of agricultural land that is no longer farmed and it grows up in weeds, annual plants, maybe starts to develop some shrubs, and eventually some pine trees come into the area. And you have a pine forest for a number of years that eventually is succeeded by broadleaf competitive plants like oaks and hickories and maple and beech. So with each change of plants, you typically have a change in animals. So ecological succession has to do with how plant and animal communities change as a piece of land changes. And these changes are in part due to the different life history characteristics that these organisms, plants and animals, have. So you might uh, get from this the importance of the study of ecology, and you really can pick out with ecology how important adaptations are in plants and animals, and how these adaptations are meant to be favorable for the environment that the plant or animal is living within. So ecology is a great field to study if you want to see the impacts of evolution and adaptations on organisms as they live in and deal with the environment. So that kind of concludes life histories. We're going to talk about some interesting mating behaviors and mating strategies in the next chapter, chapter 12. We'll talk about social systems of social mating systems and sexual selection in this particular chapter. So I'll see you soon. You take care and God bless y'all. Bye.